You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your euphoric host, Abraham.
And I am your munchies-driven host, Shane.
We're a psychology podcast, and if you are joining us for the first time, welcome. This should be a fun one, I think.
Yeah, I think this will be cool, because I feel like this is a thing that maybe the war on drugs has made a little bit taboo.
Yeah.
Thanks, Reagan, or whoever you were. But I think this will be a really interesting one, and this is going to be one of those ones that gets into a little bit of like chemistry and some of the other things that maybe we don't spend a lot of time with.
Definitely a lot of neurology. There's going to be just a whole bunch of neurology terms thrown around, and we'll do our best to unpack those as we get to them. But hey, if you're joining us for the first time, as I said, welcome. And you may support us by doing a few things. You can join us on Patreon. You can buy some merch. You can like on a social media platform. You can subscribe. You can recommend us to a friend. You can breed a new strain of cannabis and name it after us and make money selling it, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, I like that.
I'll talk more about the ways you can support us at the end of this discussion today. But as you may have gotten from that, what we are talking about today is drugs.
Yes, specifically, we are talking about THC, and we are talking about how and why THC gets you high.
Yeah, how does that thing work? Why does it do it? How does it do it?
Yeah.
That sort of thing. Now, Shane, this episode comes out on March 1st, and March 1st has some notable holidays that one might want to recognize and participate in meaningfully. What do we got?
We've got World Music Therapy Day, which I feel like every day is Music Therapy Day for me because I listen to so much music.
It's a fact. It is also Zero Discrimination Day, which I assume means don't discriminate against people.
Yeah, it's a good general rule.
Yeah.
It's also Self-Injury Awareness Day. I think it's super important.
National Minnesota Day, for whatever that means and whatever that's worth.
Yeah.
Happy day, Minnesota.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you like cheese curds, that's cool.
Sure.
It's also National Dadgum That's Good Day.
Sweet.
I didn't even bother looking it up because I just was like, this is a thing that exists. I like it.
Sure. Well, speaking of things that exist that I like, it is National Peanut Butter Lovers Day. So our day, for one.
Yeah.
This also could be every day, and maybe should be every day, but let's make it special. We'll keep it unique. It'll be just for today. Go out and have some peanut butter.
Yes. So, which I think aligns well with the topic of this episode.
Indeed.
In the week that we want to celebrate, it's also World Glaucoma Day. So, in keeping in line with the theme.
World Glaucoma Day or World Glaucoma Week?
I'm sorry, World Glaucoma Week.
Okay.
Is what I meant to say.
Oh, that does line up with what we're talking about today.
Yeah.
It is a Girl Scout Week, also aligned with our topic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you like Thin Mints or Samoas or whatever your preferred Girl Scout cookie is.
Yeah.
It's also National Inhalants and Poisons Awareness Week. So, again, I guess kind of aligning with what we're talking about.
Depending on how you interpret it, I suppose.
Yeah.
It is International Women's Week. So women around the world, it's your week.
It's the week that International Women's Day is celebrated. So shout out to women. Women rule.
Have a great week.
Yeah, have a great week. You get one. It's also National Nutrition Month. So, load up on peanut butter.
That's right. Just layer these as much as you can.
Yeah.
Similarly, it's National Sauce Month because sauce is good.
Sauce is good, especially peanut sauce.
Yes.
See? We got this. And peanut sauce is dadgum good.
It is dadgum good. I was just about to say that. Yeah. So listen to some music while eating peanut butter, practicing zero discrimination, and also not engaging in self-injury. Appreciating how dadgum good everything is, particularly that peanut butter. Probably, it sounds like you might be smoking cannabis or consuming it in some other way if that's your thing, particularly around the awareness of glaucoma. And women, you get a free pass to do whatever you want just this week. That could include buying Girl Scout cookies. That's as much as I can layer for celebrating these simultaneously.
In Minnesota.
In Minnesota. Yes. How did I miss that? Jeez.
It's easy to miss Minnesota sometimes.
We're sorry, Minnesota. We'll bring you into the fold. Welcome in.
One day we'll do a whole episode on Minnesota. Why Minnesota exists.
Why Minnesota? That's pretty good. All right. As we said, we're actually talking about drugs, cannabis specifically, and understanding how and why it does the thing that it does. And sort of like why we seek that out in a way, if you will.
Yeah.
There's kind of a lot to unpack. I think I went a little bit broader in putting together the notes for this one than simply how it works, just because I felt like there were some other things to talk about. So this could be a multi-part episode. It probably could be an entire podcast that just talks about cannabis and various things related to cannabis, but we'll do our best to tackle it in one discussion today.
By the way, be on the lookout for our new podcast. It's just about weed called Best Buds.
Someone's going to steal that if they haven't already.
Hey, listen, we just copyrighted it. So unless it already exists. So
yeah.
Anyway,
that's true.
The history of drugs, specifically weed. A 2020 pollen study found that cannabis likely evolved 28 million years ago on the Eastern Tibetan Plateau. I do appreciate and like the idea of stoned dinosaurs. I do like that.
Indeed. Well, and we'll talk about consuming it in its various forms. Now, interestingly, cannabis is actually closely related to the same plant we now often use for a different but related reason. Although rather than smoking this cannabis cousin, we drink it. That plant is hops.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that. I like that. Now, cannabis evolved this complex chemical that coincidentally mimics our own neurotransmitters. This chemical is called delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. I think I did pretty good with that.
Yeah, that's good, yeah.
Or THC for short. It also contains cannabidiol or CBD. So you're going to hear THC and CBD quite a bit in this episode.
Yeah, and you've probably heard different pronunciations of those words depending on where you're at and who you're talking to, and that's okay. THC and CBD is where we land,
yes.
And we all agree on how to say those letters.
Yes, mostly.
Okay, so 28 million years ago, this plant evolved on the Eastern Tibetan Plateau. Why would a plant evolve such a unique chemistry? Unfortunately, we aren't sure. But some hypotheses have more or less converged on similar ideas that seem like reasonable explanations for why a plant would ever evolve this chemical that mimics our neurotransmitter to begin with. Primarily because it wasn't trying to evolve a chemical to mimic our neurotransmitter. It just happens to do that. It happens to look and function somewhat similarly, but it also does other things relevant for the plant. One is that this chemical seems to promote survival in an important way that are unique to the circumstances in which the cannabis plant would find itself, right? Where it is grown or where it could be potentially grown.
Right. So the leaves of a cannabis plant contain glands called trichomes, which produce THCA, which might defend against some insects that would eat the plant. It defends against frost in colder climates. It minimizes loss in windy locations. It blocks some amount of UV radiation that might otherwise cause the plant to overheat, and it may attract pollinators. So this thing that it produces actually serves as like a kind of a catalyst for all, or like it serves in a beneficial way in all these these areas.
It seems to largely be like it's the Captain America shield of plants.
Yeah.
It does all these things 100%.
For it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Almost doesn't matter what you're throwing at it. It's going to be protective.
Yeah. It's like everything that comes at it goes ting, ting, ting.
Yeah.
That's what this thing does.
A very fancy umbrella, that shield.
Uh-huh.
Very heavy, expensive umbrella, too.
Yes.
Some have also speculated that THC might have caused some leaf-eating insects to become high so that after eating the plant, they forget where they were and can't find the plant again. A little less evidence for that one, but there's like the potential that maybe that's what's going on for some of them.
I just picture this beetle just like taking a chunk out of one of these plants and then getting so high. It's like, oh man, I can't find it again. Am I a bug? Obviously, those are stereotypes for like being stoned, but I do appreciate like a stoned beetle, not John Lennon, but a different one. Now, Asian farmers discovered that this hemp plant produced a useful oil, probably medicinally, and the fibers of its husk made really good rope. It was strong, durable, flexible, and resistant to mold and moisture. It could also be used to make paper, clothing, and its seeds were edible for food. So there are a lot of benefits from this plant.
Super versatile plant.
Yeah.
And one of the things that helps a plant be very successful in this world is, unfortunately, for it to be very useful to humans, because then we will make sure that there is a million of that plant around. This has actually happened
yes.
for plants that produce caffeine. Tea trees and coffee plants have spread way beyond what they would have normally existed in their numbers because they produce a chemical that humans like so much. Mm-hmm. Similar with these plants, is they have ensured their survival for the long term by not only having a chemical that protects them against the element, but making it a chemical that is very desirable to a large number of humans.
Yes, people are so stoked about this thing.
Yes. Now, the original plant likely did not contain these super high concentrations of THC and CBD that you might find in more plants today. But once humans found out what these plants did when they were consumed in different ways, we found a way to breed them to make a much more potent version of themselves, unaware, of course, what we were actually breeding. Just knew that you could select certain characteristics, you'd end up with a much more effective plant. And what we're breeding were plants with much higher THC contents and often much higher CBD as well.
And this is something you can kind of see happen in real time.
Yeah. Kicked in overdrive now.
Yeah, I mean, it really is like has like totally gone off the rails. But, you know, when you talk to people who would get weed in like the 60s and 70s and even the 80s, they'll talk about how much stronger weed is today when you go buy it, because of stuff like this. And we'll talk more about some of that stuff, but they'll say like, you know, they can't smoke newer weed. They wish they had old weed because it was like more tolerable and they weren't so high. So
doesn't take much these days. I'm going to understand.
It really doesn't. Then an excavation in Xinjiang, Uyghur, near the Flaming Mountains, found the body of a 2,750-year-old man carrying cannabis plants with much higher than expected THC concentration. From this, it is likely that at least 2,500 to 2,800 years ago, people discovered that inhaling the smoke of burning hemp plants caused enjoyable experiences or enjoyable experience alterations and began cultivating it more intentionally to do this better. That is, to have more of the good stuff in it.
Exactly right. Okay, now, Greek historian Herodotus, who we've referenced a lot in a recent episode discussing the Spartans, he described the Scythians, a related nation nearby, as burning and inhaling the fumes of the cannabis plant for its euphoric effects. So that also speaks to, again, how this was starting to make its way around in sort of ancient history, that people knew what it did and were using it for recreational use and not for medicinal use, not necessarily for anything other than the fact that it caused them to get high.
Now, a purified form of cannabis called hashish was commonly smoked in the Middle East and parts of Asia around 1400 years ago. And in fact, alcohol was specifically banned from the Quran, but hashish was not. And so I think that's kind of an interesting thing that there are some allowances. And you'll hear that, I think, in lots of world religions.
I've actually heard part of coffee's success was also due to the fact that it was not prohibited by religion and alcohol was. So during temperance movements, people would drink a lot more coffee and you'd see this spring up of coffee houses. So we were going to basically, I think the summary of that story or the takeaway message is that people want drugs. They want them badly. And if you take them away, they will find other drugs that you have not taken away. And that is basically how it goes.
Yes.
Now, largely because of hemp's utility, it began to spread around the world as humans took this useful plant with them. As we said, it's great for rope, clothing, paper. You can even eat it. So it's multi-purpose, super durable, super flexible, really useful plant, right? So it starts in this eastern Tibetan plateau. It starts to spread around. It makes its way first to Africa, then to Europe. Of course, the colonizers brought it with them to the Americas, where it did particularly in the warm regions of Central America. There was really great growing conditions for it there.
You'll find that that's kind of a thing. Like there are certain, with coffee, there's something called the coffee belt. That coffee grows really, really well in these particular regions. And so it would make sense that like in parts of Central America and like more floral, lush areas that this would really, really pick up steam, you know?
Right.
In the early U.S. colonies, the value of hemp was so widely regarded that farmers were required to grow cannabis in a few colonies. I love that idea so much that it was like a requirement at some point in time, and everybody was like, whoa, wait, it's all illegal. And they started kind of putting a bunch of bans on it.
Yeah, it went from, in order to live here, you have to grow marijuana, to if you even so much as think about marijuana, we will throw you in prison.
Yes, it's what a wild turnaround.
Yeah, that is a definite roller coaster, if ever there was a roller coaster of laws.
Yeah.
In 1830, a doctor named Sir William Brooke O'Shaughnessy, guess where he's from. That's a very Irish name.
Arguably the most Irish name I've ever heard in my life.
Yeah, possibly all Irish names were built off of that one.
Yeah, this is the template. Thanks, Doc.
So Dr. O'Shaughnessy discovered that cannabis extracts were useful for reducing stomach pain felt by people who were suffering from cholera. It wouldn't necessarily cure their cholera, but it would ease their pain for a bit.
Interesting. This was banned. Cannabis was banned in the U.S. in 1931, but California was the first state to legalize cannabis for medical use in 1996. So it was banned for quite some time before everybody was like, actually, this might be helpful.
Yeah, that certainly the tide has changed in the United States. It wasn't until a couple of Israeli scientists discovered delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or that THC, in 1964. They didn't actually know what THC was or that was the active ingredient until 1964.
Wow.
That's when people began to understand how the silly sticky plant began to do its thing, is by understanding that chemical, because then we could start looking at how it interacts with our brains.
And now we can make just chocolate bars that are just straight up THC, apparently.
Fact.
The question is, and really what we're trying to get at is, how does this work? And what is it doing to our brain to produce a sense of euphoria? Is it dangerous? And is it beneficial? So what we're going to do is we're going to step away, inhale or eat or enjoy whatever it is that you prefer. And we'll be back after these ads.
Almost forgot to come back. Here we are, though.
and now the Beatles in the back of my head. Where am I, man?
Should do it in John Lennon voice.
If I could do a John Lennon voice, I absolutely would. But it's like I can't even fake an English accent without being incredibly offensive.
Fair enough. So, as we sort of were alluding to the fact that marijuana, cannabis, was required growing in the United States, became completely illegal, which spread across the United States and was banned entirely. And then since the mid-2000s, well, I guess starting in 1996 with medical marijuana, but then in the early aughts and the early 2000 teens, we've actually started to see legalization of the recreational use of cannabis, and that has started spreading across the United States. Now, many other countries have already had at least decriminalized cannabis, but the United States is sort of early to this, and with the legalization of it, the cannabis industry has absolutely exploded in the United States. Wildly successful, way outperforming even many of their most optimistic ideas of like how much money that it would make in some places. There is a caveat to that, which is that certain states have slammed so many regulations and expenses and fees and taxes on cannabis that it still is sometimes more profitable for drug dealers to walk the streets selling cannabis, meaning that they can sell it for pretty competitive prices. So there are places where it's not as successful as others, but in general, in many places in the United States, you can just walk to the store like a liquor store and buy a cannabis product and walk out.
Yeah.
And that's totally legal. And then go home and use it as much or as little as you want. That's totally legal. So it is a thing out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is really interesting because when I was growing up, that was always a worry in my house because it was illegal. And so, like, people in my house might have engaged or partook for many years, but it was always like a secret. And then when Florida came out and was like, "Oh yeah, no, it's legal now. You can get a medical marijuana card," and folks in my house went and got it. Nothing changed. The amount did not change. It's just that the people that we were getting it from were just above board, if you will.
Yeah. So it went from just no longer taboo. Like there's less anxiety, less paranoia, there's less concern. It's just a thing that one does, similar to consuming alcohol or honestly tea or coffee. So
yeah, super interesting. So this leads us to the question of how it works, because we keep talking about this like euphoric state, and we talk about people who have been doing this for centuries, millennia even.
Yeah.
I couldn't imagine like the guy that they found that died with his weed. He's like, nobody's getting it. This is my stash. It's coming with me.
Bury me with my weed.
Bury me with my weed. So why? How does this work? Because this seems like a really powerful thing and people seem really interested in it.
Now, as we mentioned, trigger warning, so many brain terms coming. We'll try and unpack these as we go along, but we're going to be spouting some things, and that's okay. Like, don't be too afraid. We'll get through it.
Yeah.
First, and a very important part of understanding any of this is our brain already has some things called endogenous cannabinoid neurotransmitters, such as one called anandamide or anandamide. I've heard it pronounced a couple different ways, in what's called our endocannabinoid system.
Got it. Totally followed that.
Great. I'll break this down. What this really means is that our brain makes a chemical that's structurally similar to cannabis naturally. Like it already occurs in our brain, right? Mm-hmm. This also means that there are receptor sites in our brain that are for this chemical that, again, is very chemically similar to cannabis, which means that when cannabis gets in there, it has a place for it to go in almost every part of our brain, wherever those endogenous cannabinoids go. Now, we did not evolve to consume THC, and THC did not evolve to interact with our brains. We just so happened to evolve very similar chemicals that work together in similar ways in our brains. And by ingesting them, we can control how much is there.
Yeah, we were very lucky it worked. Is basically what that comes down to. Honestly,
because you could really imagine there's a ton of chemicals that our brains don't produce that we could find in our food or in the wild that could either be smoked or consumed or ingested in some way that would affect our brains. But because we just don't have the receptor sites for them, they just don't do anything to us. So it just happens to be that THC is one that does.
I look at it like this, like, so your body is equipped to be able to fit the parts in, right? Like, so you've got so this plant produces certain parts, those parts can fit into your brain naturally because those parts already exist, like the receptors exist.
Yep.
But like snake venom, we don't have something that produces snake venom in our system, so that's why it's so toxic for us.
Fair enough.
I think that's the way that I would look at it. Is like we were lucky that we adapted to be able to smoke plants, and we are unfortunate that we were not able to adapt to snake venom yet.
Otherwise, maybe snake venom would have been an awesome high that people enjoyed.
I think there are people out there that smoke snake venom or drink snake venom. I think that is the thing.
God.
So maybe we'll do an episode. That's a mini. Like people that get high off snake supply.
Not recommended.
Not recommended. Yeah. Just to be clear, that's the caveat on our end. Now, the anandamide, however it's pronounced, was discovered in the 1990s and occurs in high abundance in our brain when we feel a sense of joy and happiness. And it's also implicated in our ability to not store memories or to forget things. So we tend to, this thing that we discovered in the 90s is partially responsible for why we forget things, which is actually very useful because it would be very difficult to navigate an experience in which we could not forget things easily. So like we have this thing in our brains that allows us to kind of be involved with remembering things and forgetting things and all that.
And of course, remembering that this is a naturally occurring chemical in our brain.
Yeah.
Anandamide or anandamide comes from a Sanskrit word meaning inner bliss. So you can see that they were linking it with that sense of joy that is experienced in our brain and all of that to the experience that it produces from the chemical itself and how it sort of works. And so if THC mimics what this chemical does, you can start to see already why we would have the experiences that we have when we consume THC.
Yep, absolutely.
Now, in our brain, there are two types of sites, actually in our bodies, there are two types of sites that can receive cannabinoids. There's the CB1 and CB2. CB1 receptors are really where the party is at with respect to how THC affects us.
Hell yeah.
Yeah. So that's where when you consume cannabis recreationally, it's going to CB1 receptors.
So specifically, these are found in the cerebellum, which is often referred to as the control center of the brain, where sensory information and coordinated motor movements are located. Also speech, attention, and emotion, all those things. Also, the basal ganglia are referred to as the switchboard for coordinating voluntary movements, the hippocampus, often referred to as the memory processing center, and a part of the spinal cord that is important for processing pain information. Also, the neocortex, the ventral striatum, the amygdala, nucleus accumbens, orbitoprefrontal cortex, there we go, and the hypothalamus. See, I took neurology classes.
Yeah, we got there.
That is, many parts of the brain are set up to receive these chemicals.
Yes. So that was fun. That was so many things that we just gave you. And yeah, as you said, in sum, the cannabinoid receptors are most densely packed in areas of our brain commonly associated with coordination, thinking and planning, time perception, hunger, memory, and pleasure. Even if you didn't know from reputation or otherwise what THC did, just describing that it affects those systems in some profound way would give you a fairly decent idea, I think, of what you were likely to experience by consuming cannabis in, large quantities and whatnot.
Yeah, I read that and I go, yeah, I have enjoyed cannabis here and there, and my coordination is off. I cannot plan a thing. It seems like time goes on forever. I definitely get the munchies. I forget what I watched while I was high. Like, I watched Dune while I was high one time, and I could not remember for the life of me what happened in that movie. And I had to watch it again while I was sober. But I was stoked about it the entire time, so the pleasure thing makes sense too.
Yeah, very enjoyable, even if confused.
Yes. I went, wow, this is beautiful. I love this. Whatever is happening with Timothée Chalamet.
Now, to be clear, it's important to point out that although there's all of these sort of euphoric, pleasurable parts, it is also related to our experience of stress and anxiety. Like, those are also part of that system. And like worry is, I think, part of that too.
Right. So by chance, THC molecules are very similar to our naturally produced neurotransmitters and easily connect to these parts of the brain. With that being said, the thing that we're talking about is THC has to get into your system to be able to contact those receptors, and it has to be processed and be able to do that. So there are actually many ways to ingest cannabis. The most common include smoking the dried leaves, vaping it, eating it, or drinking it in a tea or other beverage. How it is consumed does affect the process in some ways. Not all the ways, but at least some ways.
Right. Now, many of you will know that our brains need a steady, constant supply of oxygen.
Big fan.
Thus, the lungs are a fast track to our brains. Like, we can go very little time without oxygen before our brain starts suffering damage and breaking down. So it needs this constant, steady supply of oxygen. Now, what happens is heating cannabis plants converts THCA, that's naturally occurring in it, to THC. Thus, smoking or vaping cannabis allows the THC to enter our blood, cross the blood-brain barrier, and go into our brains, and it starts to produce the effect within minutes, sometimes almost instantly.
Yeah.
And it will peak in its effect after 20 to 30 minutes, depending on several factors, although its overall effects could last as many as 2 or 3 hours.
Now, cannabis baked into oral consumables, such as gummies, brownies, or literally anything you can orally consume, means that the cooking or baking process heats the plant in the same way as heating it for smoking does, and unlocks that THC component. For example, like we talked about brownies, I've seen cookies, I've seen chocolate bars. We mentioned that earlier. Yep. People make like an infused butter.
Yep.
Like, there's all kinds of different things that people put out there. It's super fascinating. You can actually go, I think, right now and buy plenty of recipe books that have different ways to kind of process and consume marijuana in different ways, or to get this THC thing.
I've seen them on sour belts. I've seen them on those like chewy fruit candies. I've seen them in dried fruits. I've even seen them in a steak rub. Yeah. That's like, you're supposed to put it, you like literally rub it into your steak. It literally is anything you can think of that you can consume orally as a foodstuff. Yeah. Has or can have THC added to it anyway. Yeah. Anything.
I've seen Rice Krispie treats. I've seen like mints, like almost like Altoids.
And marshmallows.
I've seen, one of my favorite ones was in Vegas. They had this like a blueberry. It's like a blueberry crisp, like a white chocolate blueberry crisp that was really good. Yeah. And I think about that a lot, actually. I think about that one. I'm like, man, I really wish I could find whatever that was and get more of that. Like, it was tasty. I would eat it without THC. Sure. It just was like an added benefit. Basically, what we're saying is like there are endless ways to do this. And consuming edibles means that the THC must first be processed by the liver before it enters the bloodstream on its way to your brain. So it's it gets to your brain in a different way.
Yes. And when it's processed by the liver, the delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol is then converted into 11-OH THC, which is a different form of the chemical. And the 11-OH THC has a higher affinity for those cannabinoid receptors in the brain, or those THC receptors. So what that means is, 1, it takes longer to process due to having to go through our digestive system. 2, because the new chemical's affinity for our brain is stronger, it can last much longer and have more pronounced effects. What that ultimately means is that it can take 30 to 90 minutes to affect you at all, rather than the almost instantaneous burst from smoking it would.
Right.
And it may not reach its peak effectiveness until 3 hours later, with its effects lasting up to 12 to 24 hours.
That is wild.
Yeah.
So while you all prepare your recipes and send us a gift basket some way of maybe whatever delicious brownies you have made, please remember that we're vegan. While you prepare that, we're going to take an ad break.
Okay, we're back. Hopefully you aren't too busy stirring your brownie mix or maybe making like a special mac and cheese type thing.
Oh man, that sounds really good actually.
Right? I was just thinking, I was like, this seems right up the alley for sort of stoner food, box mac and cheese.
I want to be clear. Neither of us are currently using during this episode. It sounds like we are because we're talking about food. I think we both just really like food.
We like food. We are frequently giggly. I think our normal state of being is giggly.
Yes.
So that's where we find ourselves.
We're baseline giggly.
Yeah. Baseline giggly, much higher than the average, really.
Yes.
We're like a full standard deviation above a normal level of giggly.
Yeah. 100%. We take fun seriously.
Okay, we were talking about when THC enters our brains. That's what it does. Okay, it gets there. It attaches to these receptor sites in the synaptic region of neurons. Okay, a quick deep dive on neurons, how they basically work. Neurons aren't really connected. They are connected, but they're not totally connected. They're connected at these junctions. And at the junctions, they talk to each other through neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitters get released by one neuron and absorbed by a second neuron. And which neurotransmitters go into that junction determine both which ones can then go into its junction the next time that neuron fires, and it communicates a specific message. And so usually if it's something like put one foot in front of the other, might be the message one neuron tells the next neuron, then that message goes through cleanly and smoothly and you execute on said action. However, when we disrupt that process, different things can occur.
Yes. One of the things to think about here is that THC does not actually cause a flood of dopamine. So like dopamine being one of the things that gets passed, some of the information that gets passed between those neurotransmitters, right? Like they get received and all that.
Yeah.
It doesn't produce this flood of dopamine. It can trigger dopamine releases, which creates a sense of reward and satisfaction, and often is associated with great desires and the desire to produce the effect again. So we want to kind of go back to getting that dopamine, but dopamine is not what gets you high.
Right. Yeah. The dopamine itself does not create that high effect. Okay. So as we were describing, when a neuron fires, it releases these neurotransmitters that communicate whether to fire again. And so quoting from Dr. Piamelli from Live Science blog, she says, THC comes in like a sledgehammer. That's her direct quote.
Okay.
And it floods the endocannabinoid system and tell a lot of neurons to stop firing. And what this does is it breaks the neural communication between the parts of your brain, and it creates this experience of being high, because all of a sudden one neuron is saying something like, put one foot in front of the other, and the other neuron hears, eat my foot, and it says, no, walk, dummy. And it says like, who's a dummy? And then the other one says, just step forward, and the receiving neuron says, like, can I eat? Step forward? What is that?
Yeah.
And so there's just a breakdown in communication where they no longer are talking to each other in a meaningful way. And that creates this sense of just disconnectedness.
Yeah, and it makes sense. Like if you're only having like a couple neurotransmitters that are doing that, like it's not going to be as much of an issue, right? So this neuron is like, it's going to break down here and there. You're going to be fine, right? But if all of them are doing it at the same time, then it's just basically your brain going, like they don't know what to do, right? It's like they're running around with the Kermit arms. So like while you're feeling great, your brain is actually kind of panicking because it doesn't know how to communicate with itself.
Yeah, it's fair.
Which is kind of fun. So the mixture of effects from the release of the dopamine, which is a sense of reward, the similarity to anandamine, which is our natural joy chemical, and the inhibition of processing memories and experiences in real time, the effect is fairly predictable. You get laughter and giggling. You get fascination in everything, including mundane objects, for sure. You get relaxation and low stress in a lot of cases.
Very commonly, people report a sense of their time is slowing down. There is a stereotyped and accurate level of a desire to munch on snacks or any food, and there's a heightened sensitivity to fun or pleasurable things.
Yeah, and there's also slow motor reaction times, there's forgetfulness, and there's sleepiness. I'll tell you right now, though, one thing I have learned is that I got to stay in bed because I will go grab some snack and I'm like, it is the best. It tastes so good. Like I'll go get something and I'm like, this cookie is the best cookie I've ever had in my life. And because I'm overweight, I'm like, I can't do that. So I have to be really mindful of that.
Must be careful. Calories are still calories.
Yeah, calories are still calories no matter how high you are. So
yeah, so in short, euphoria or a sense of being disconnected in a non-stressful way, but there is the opposite The opposite of that carefree experience can still occur. As we said, this is also is related to things like anxiety and stress and worry.
Right. So this goes back to our discussion on psychoactive chemicals in general. An important part of predicting the experience of a drug is set and setting, meaning where are you, how do you feel, and what are you expecting when you take the drug? Because all of those things really change the experience.
Right. Even beyond how you're feeling in the moment and being generally prone to anxiety or even contacting stressful experiences while high, or even if you aren't, people may instead report a sense of paranoia, anxiety, a worrying level of loss of control. And so some people who tends to feel anxious anyway, this can actually just elevate that feeling of anxiousness and paranoia.
Yeah. Now, scientists report that concentrations of THC to the posterior region of the brain, or the butt of the brain, are associated with these effects. So it is unclear how it ends up in that system. Rather than the fun one, some scientists believe genetics may be a factor and that some people are just going to have an unpleasant time when they use marijuana or they get certain concentrations of THC in their system.
Yeah, for some reason, the brain just punts it back to the part of your brain that's more associated with like stress and worry.
Yeah.
Most people it doesn't, but in some people it does. And so they just always have a bad time. But it seems like it's not super consistent, but it might be more consistent for some people than others.
Right. So then when you have those neurons that are firing, the ones that communicate and the ones aren't communicating, it ends up being like the ones that make you anxious tend to over communicate. And then the ones that are trying to make you relax, they can't connect. So the only message that's coming through is, you know, whatever's making you paranoid. On top of the fact that when you're under the influence, you're probably not, your planning isn't very good and your thought processes aren't very good.
Yeah.
So like it makes sense that you get a little bit more paranoid and can't really like come down off of that sometimes.
I did see in some of the research I was doing for this that many have proposed that too much THC, like going over a certain limit, is more likely to trigger the feeling of paranoia and anxiety. And so you could potentially calibrate that by being careful about how much you actually consume. But that is an important point to note here is that THC is actually non-toxic to humans. And so as far as most people have been able to tell, with naturally occurring THC, there doesn't seem to be a limit at which taking it will result in a level of toxicity in your body, meaning that it needs medical intervention because it becomes dangerous. Don't test that.
Yeah.
But people have tried and they so far haven't been able to find it. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. We just haven't found it yet. But either way, much, much, much more difficult to overdose on THC than almost any other drug.
Right.
Like, the upper limit, wherever it might be, and it probably exists, but it's way above things like alcohol, even caffeine,
right?
You know, heroin, amphetamines, anything like those all have a relatively low toxicity level, and weeds is like so obscenely high, we're not even sure what it is.
I've met people, and this is totally anecdotal, but I've met people who will like pass out because they have a hard time breathing, but it's not because of THC, it's because of some other factor that's related to like them maybe panicking or getting overly anxious and hyperventilating or something like that.
Yeah, and most of what I've heard is that if you do consume THC to that level, the most likely effect is that you'll just fall asleep. And so you partially can't consume anymore is potentially one of the reasons that it happens that way.
Right.
Now, you probably are wondering, with all the things that we've said, then, is it true that taking THC or taking cannabis, smoking weed, smoking pot, smoking marijuana, what have you, leads to then doing harder and harder drugs? In short, is marijuana a gateway drug? You're going to have to listen to these capitalists try and sell you stuff for a second, try and sell you marijuana maybe, and come back and find out. All right, so you have your CBD lotion in hands that our advertisers sold you maybe, and we're talking about, is marijuana a gateway drug to other quote unquote harder drugs?
All the churches say yes. There's consensus, at least in the churches.
Yes, they do.
Yeah, all of them. Now, the NIH reports that more people who use cannabis went on to use alcohol, or if they were already using alcohol, they were likely to use it more. So there is some information that says there's like a correlation there, but not necessarily causation.
Now, also, according to the NIH, the National Institute of Health in the United States, for those of you who didn't know the acronym, the majority of people do not go on to try other substances. So although there were some that used more alcohol, or they started using alcohol, or they used it more, most people do not go on to try the substances. And the hypothesis originally stating that they would get into cocaine and heroin and all kinds of other harder drugs. That just doesn't seem to be the case. At least, the National Institute of Health and other data do not suggest that.
Right. At this point in time, there's no evidence that people are likely to start using other drugs because they started using marijuana. But if marijuana or alcohol if those happen first, it is likely because they're easier to obtain and the user was seeking anything at the time.
Yeah.
So if it's easier to obtain and it's relatively safe comparatively and all of those things, and we'll kind of talk about all that later, but it makes sense that those would be the first things that people would access.
Yeah. If someone was going to use cocaine, and cocaine was easier to get than marijuana, they're probably going to use cocaine. Right. It just happens to be the case that it was far easier to come by marijuana in most circumstances for most people. So at best, you have a correlation that almost certainly does not imply causation.
Right.
And so we actually have a direct quote that says, quote, "Overall, the research on cannabis as a gateway drug is not conclusive. Even studies that do show a link only show a very weak one or rely on low quality data." End quote. So the evidence just isn't there. We don't think that cannabis functions as a gateway drug in any way that's meaningful for understanding how predictive it is that someone who uses cannabis is likely to go on using harder drugs.
And when we say we think that, we mean scientists.
Right.
Scientists think that. There's no sufficient evidence to say otherwise. So thanks, Dare, for putting that in our heads. If you want to go back to the Dare episode and you want to realize how much that didn't work, these are one of the kind of the leftovers for our generation.
Yeah, there you go. All right. Now, we have oscillated between calling it marijuana, calling it weed, calling it cannabis. What is the deal with these different names?
There are so many names, and I'm so excited to talk about this because I always think of, I believe it's Biodome, they call it Purple Sticky Punch. And so I think of all the things that, and maybe in the movie Half Baked, where they have he's in the closet and he's grabbing a bunch of them and they're all different names like Maui Wowie and stuff.
Yeah.
I got to say, one of my favorite things about weed culture is the names.
They're very creative.
When I was in Seattle, I went to a dispensary and I was buying a joint. And the one joint that I got was called Little Baby Jesus, is what it was called.
Okay.
I was like, why is it called Little Baby Jesus? And it was because the strain was called God's Light.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah. There's this fun humor in the current culture with it right now.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to note that.
It would have also made sense if it was because of Talladega Nights somehow.
Yeah, exactly. 6 pound, 12 ounce, Little Baby Jesus.
That's right. All right, so a weed by any other name. There have been so many names for this, but there's some history around where those names come from. So an anti-cannabis politician who led prohibition efforts said, quote, "There are 100,000 total marijuana smokers in the U.S. The most are Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers. Their satanic music, jazz, and swing result from marijuana use. This marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes, entertainers, and any others." End quote. So this guy sucks and we hate him.
Yeah, we don't like him. But it's really important. Some of the anti-weed campaigns did come from racist sentiments.
Yeah, honestly.
I mean, genuinely.
Almost completely.
Yeah, and you can see that within our current prison systems. So there is almost a weed to prison pipeline that is directly correlated with specific racist tendencies.
Right.
And for those of you who are watching the video, you saw me point at my screen. I was pointing at the notes. So, because that's what I was like, yeah, that guy. But that's honestly the issue. The anti-drug campaigns, the war on drugs are an inherently racist propaganda machine. It's a real problem.
Yeah, exactly. One of the words that's commonly used, and we've used here, is marijuana. The word marijuana is a Mexican word that may have been slang for brothel, was a hypothesis that I saw for it.
Interesting.
But the use of the word marijuana specifically and choosing to use that by politicians has been employed because it sounds foreign, and it was useful for stoking fear and xenophobic hatred of others. So it's just leaning into this idea of trying to create a divide in the races and trying to create a fear of other races by using words that sound and are from languages of the people about whom it's meant to stoke fear. And so it's all sort of linked together in this hatred machine that's designed to make you afraid of other people and angry toward them and want harm to come to them and therefore support their agenda. And so that's why this anti-war on drugs campaign sounds like this wholesome pro-family thing. It's really just subterfuge for being a racist way to target and marginalize communities of minorities.
Bet you didn't think we were going to get to racism on this episode, did you?
Now, I will say that there has been some movement by some people who are in support of the use of marijuana, saying that trying to strip it of that term actually takes it away from its the roots of what Mexican culture has associated with it, or the Mexican contribution to marijuana, or its growing and that sort of thing. So some actually do push toward using marijuana as a word, but in general, because of its history of racist use, a lot of people, including many dispensaries, have started to move away from that.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the questions that comes up and one of the names that comes up is pot. And so why it's called pot or has ever been called pot is unknown. Some speculate that it's shorthand or a shorthand version of the Spanish phrase potación de Gaia.
I guess Gaia. I'm not sure.
Guay. Meaning potion of grief, referring to alcohol mixed with THC. Some speculate it comes from a teapot, wherein people used to infuse tea with cannabis, but there's very little evidence that either of these is correct, so we don't quite know where that came from.
Another one very common that we've used is weed. The name weed seems to come from conflating a plant called loco weed that grows in Mexico with cannabis plants. Loco weed was a plant that cattle and other livestock would eat that is not a cannabis plant, but it was called loco weed, and it would make them sick, right? So they would eat this plant that they called loco weed, but apparently it was either looked like cannabis or it was maybe just related to it in some way. The theory goes that loco weed and cannabis were confused for one another, and when cannabis was eventually banned from cultivation in California in 1913, first ones to ban it, first ones to bring it back.
Interesting.
They referred to it in that banning cannabis as loco weed. And again, this is out of a misunderstanding of the difference between those two plants.
And this is why we need scientists that make decisions and not politicians. Like if a botanist were involved in all of this, then there's no way that loco weed or marijuana would have been banned.
Right.
Oh, all right. So you've also heard us kind of mention the phrase strains. Like we said this a couple times. And I think this is one of the more fascinating things about THC and marijuana and all that and kind of how this works. We call this section "Don't Strain Yourself." And I like that. So thank you, Abraham, for that one. So scientists have actually discovered over 100 different cannabinoids in different THC plants. They have very different combinations of different cannabinoids and terpenes and CBD and a whole host of other things. So every strain is a little bit different.
That makes them look different, smell different, taste different, and most people will report feeling different effects. And of course, that begs the question, do they then have predictable and consistent different effects?
The thing that we kind of come back to is that they are also genetically similar, that the effects are nearly identical. So like you're kind of going to see this, and it's really more about amount and other factors that are kind of absent or independent of the plant. You're going to see that kind of be a factor that comes up a lot.
Yeah, and despite the incredible number of possible combinations that we mentioned and the different cannabinoids, the different levels of CBD to THC to whatever that are in there, I mean, there's others. I know that there are others. I'm not listing them all for the sake of not flooding you with that many acronyms.
Yeah.
But despite that, the effects have been wildly inconsistent. They've done these double-blind taste tests where the person who's getting it don't know what they're receiving, the person who's giving it doesn't know what they're giving them, but they do have a record of who got what, like someone who's not administering it, and they can go back later and check. We've talked about double-blind on here before. Mm-hmm. But in these double-blind sort of taste tests, if you will, or experiments, people have reported highly variable effects from supposedly different or similar strains. And that includes widely recognized categories such as sativas and indicas, that they'll say like a sativa has one effect versus an indica has another effect. And then there's these hybrids that are supposed to have a mix effect. And what people report with their experience is someone is consistent when they know what they're consuming. But as soon as they don't know whether they're getting an indica or sativa, all of a sudden it becomes very unpredictable what the effect that they report will be.
Right. And I think that goes back to set and setting, right? That goes back to how you manage expectations around this.
Yes.
Actually, at least with respect to edibles, and possibly with respect to smoking, what we eat before and during the high may also alter or titrate the effects of what we consume. We know that THC is lipophilic, which means it likes fats, so it's going to work well with fatty foods, things with butter and oil, which is why people make butters on them and stuff.
Yeah.
But we don't know exactly how it works, whether it makes it stronger or weaker or emphasizes one effect over another. So there's a lot of variables that impact the way that this is processed and received.
Yeah, it very well might be the case that like eating Oreos while high will make that high better or potentially worse. Or eating like a burger while high might make it potentially better or worse. And we're not totally sure. It seems like that might affect it. And also, as we said, your expectations, your overall context, all of that is going to have some kind of effect.
But eating Oreos after you're high is wonderful.
Sure. And eating peanut butter, whether or not you're high, is amazing.
Yes. Happy Peanut Butter Week.
Happy Peanut Butter Week. It always comes back to Peanut Butter Week.
It does. It does.
We do have a few more interesting tidbits for you. Maybe what we should do, though, is we should take a quick peanut butter break and then finish up with our interesting tidbits and then our recommendations.
I like that. It's time for some crunchy.
Crunchy peanut butter all the way. All right. Some things that we thought were sort of interesting to know about THC, or I guess cannabis more generally. I was curious about how it might affect animals. Now, many other non-human animals actually do also have receptors in their brain that allow them to sort of quote unquote get high if they consume cannabis. Important to know, though, is that what looks like high for an animal, even if they do have those receptors, does not mean it's going to be anything like what it means to be high as a human.
Right. So notably, a German scientist in the 1940s, bad news. Oh, yeah, problem. So this guy, anyway, he conducted experiments in which he injected different drugs into flies and that he fed to spiders and then observed the kinds of webs they built. You've probably seen this. You've probably seen this. I mean, I feel like I saw this before this episode where you saw like the different patterns and it was kind of interesting.
Yeah.
But this is kind of some of the stuff that was used in the anti-drug, this is your brain on blank drug, those anti-drug propaganda commercials in the 90s where everybody was afraid of eggs and apparently spiders. So what you'll see, and we'll share this in the show notes, but they have different spider web patterns, and you know, in a regular without any sort of in the control situation, the spider web looks pretty good. It's not symmetrical. I mean, I've seen better spider webs, so whoever the spider was okay. But under marijuana, it gets a little bit loose. Under benzodrine, it's kind of a little bit disjointed and all over the place. On caffeine, it is. For sure, this spider was just trying to get it done. They're like, we gotta go. We gotta get this done. And it's like,
it
all
doesn't
over the
even
place.
look like a web. It just looks like a stained glass window, kind of.
Yeah. And same thing with the chlorohydrate. So that is as disjointed and actually far less strands in it too. It's interesting to see its effects on spiders, but I think we were talking at the beginning of the show, and I think you made an excellent point. We're not spiders.
Yes, I guess the connection that was supposed to be here is that the human brain is so similar to a spider brain that we should extrapolate a spider's web weaving behavior, also not something humans do, to understanding how our brains work with respect to those different chemicals. If
you meet a human that starts spinning silk out of its butt, you should probably run. That thing is concerning.
Yeah, Spider-Man, but in not a good way. More like The Fly from the movie The Fly.
Yeah.
If I were to describe the web that the spider built who had consumed the marijuana flies, so we gave it edibles, basically. It really honestly looks like it got started on the web and it did pretty okay and then just kind of stopped making it.
Yeah. It was like, this is fine.
Yeah, exactly. It was like, what was I doing? I'm just going to go over here now. It's like halfway done.
Yeah. Yeah, and honestly, it looks like it would still work.
Yeah.
Like, at least to some degree.
It's definitely the second best of all the webs that we have pictures of.
Yeah, so my argument here, this teaches me that I shouldn't drink coffee. Like, this tells me that I'm perfectly fine smoking weed all the time, but I can't drink coffee. That's what this tells me.
Yeah, particularly if you're planning on building a web. Just not a good idea.
Which, I've never even gotten to it because I just smoke so much marijuana that a web has just never been a thing that I thought to do. I'm just not motivated.
Other animals here. Deer do eat people's cannabis plants. And what has happened is that people then report deer appearing frisky after eating their cannabis plants. But there's kind of there's a really reason to be skeptical of this. One, as we've mentioned, it takes a long time to be digested and processed, such that the THC actually enters the brain. And it kind of seems unlikely that the deer were being observed long enough that it was clear which one ate the plant, how much of the plant they ate, and that they were the one that was being affected in this particular way. Mm-hmm. Another point to be skeptical about is that cannabis must be heated to make the THC abundantly available. If you try to eat raw cannabis flower, you might get some effect, but not necessarily what you're thinking and the way that you want it, the level that you want it.
Yeah.
And it might not even do anything depending on various factors. So there's that. And then the third thing here is I would really like to know what objective criteria these enterprising citizen scientists use to evaluate the level of friskiness of these deer and the threshold that constitutes excessive friskiness in these deer.
Yeah.
They're bounding 4.5 inches and now they're bounding 5.5 inches. That is one frisky deer.
I interpret it as they were horny deer, so like they were trying to like come and mate with the humans. So I'm just interested in like maybe that's what which makes it that makes it an even funnier thought. Like they eat a pot plant and they're like, "Hello." Like, yeah, what's that level of more friskiness? Are they asking for the citizen's number? Are they like, did they take him out to dinner? Like, what's the scale?
The deers just start talking. They're like, "Hey, good looking. Found your stash. Thought maybe we could talk."
It sounds more like maybe the observers might have gotten into the THC.
Yeah, that's probably what it was.
Or maybe they're just doing acid. Maybe they were doing acid and they're like, "Man, they ate that plant. It's wild." So the thing is, and kind of what you just mentioned was animals that we keep as pets, or animals in general, can get high, but animals that we keep as pets can get high too. But as opposed to humans, for whom THC is non-toxic, it seems that for our pets, we have to maybe take them to the emergency room if they contact it too much, because the THC can be toxic for those animals. So, just a general recommendation, do not get your pets high.
And don't try and do it. It's not funny. It can lead to levels of toxicity. It's really sad, honestly, for them. I've heard it described as just sort of like they'll lose continence. They just are like, they seem very worried and stressed out. And anyway, not a good time. Just don't do it.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, some take-home points. This is a very old plant. We've been cultivating it for a long time. I think one of the things that has always stood out to me about this is that our brains have receptors that are prepared to be affected by THC in high concentrations in many parts of our brain. And I just thought that was always really interesting how receptive we are to this chemical.
Right. And I think an important thing is that we didn't evolve to be able to use this plant the way that we do. And the plant didn't evolve alongside us to do that as well. It just so happens that the effects that we experience from this plant are naturally occurring, and it's pretty cool. What we have done instead is we've taken that and we've amplified that to make it so that these effects are a little bit more powerful, a little bit more concentrated, so that we need less of this thing. But it's just one of those things that, biologically, we didn't evolve alongside this plant as like a symbiotic type of relationship.
Yes. Yeah. And I also think in here, there's an important fact about just understanding how it gets us high is it basically takes these parts, these normal processes in our brain. And we've talked about memory, our sense of joy, and it just scrambles those processes a little bit. It's not scrambling your brain. It's not rearranging your neurons. It's just making it harder for them to talk to one another and make sense. And in the parts of your brain where they're most densely concentrated, it's the parts that are associated with things like your memory, like your planning, like your hunger, like your pain, all of those. And so you can sort of start to predict if you start to lose your sense of time, you are less sensitive to pain, everything seems more entertaining and fun because those parts of your brains are not talking to each other. That's really describing pretty accurately what euphoria or the sense of being high feels like.
Yeah, and I think the last take-home point I would make on all this is that the most dangerous thing about this stuff is either A, giving it to your animals, or B, the languaging around the war on drugs and making it a dangerous thing. Like, those two things are arguably the most dangerous things that this plant particularly does, because it's produced kind of this like cultural phenomenon where it's made this drug, quote unquote, dangerous, but it's made the people that engage with it also dangerous. And that's where it starts getting people othered. That's when you have like an overcrowded prison system. That's when you have xenophobia really running rampant. And there are greater dangers around this, and this turns to be like it's not the drug itself, it's like kind of how people language around it.
I think it's a great point. And I don't want to add to that necessarily. I just thought it was worth pointing out that I acknowledge we did not dig into the medicinal properties for or against. We mentioned that people used it medicinally, but we did not qualify by saying whether the science backs that up super clearly or what the science has said about it. I think that's a totally different discussion that will be useful to dig into because many people specifically take marijuana for mental health treatments of various kinds. So it'll be worth a deep dive, I think, in the future. So just know, I know that we didn't address that. We didn't because it seems to be a separate topic. We were really just describing how it works today.
Agreed.
Okay. Now, a few times a year, this one movie studio is going to put out a movie, and Shane and I are going to go see that movie. We're going to do
Always.
it. And so with respect to that, it's time for recommendations.
Recommendations.
Shane, why don't you go ahead and describe what we are both recommending today?
Oh man, this movie is perfect for this topic, I think. So we both went and saw Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania.
Not together, unfortunately.
Not together, unfortunately. That would have been so wonderful. But it is one of those, I think Quantumania is the perfect title for this movie.
Yeah.
Specifically the mania part, because it is a wild ride. It does not pull any punches in terms of like weirdness. I think it achieves the weirdness that Doctor Strange so desperately wants to do, but doesn't know how to. This was like, we can do whatever we want.
Yeah.
And they really did. It was visually really wild. The creatures in it were like just so cool, so creative.
Yeah.
I learned that the art studio that helped with the art direction was called Happy Mushroom.
Nice. Wow.
Which is like 100% accurate.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And it is a starkly different Ant-Man movie. Like Ant-Man 1 and Ant-Man 2 are heist movies.
Yes.
This is not, this is a heist movie, but very different.
Yeah, only kind of, and only in like one part of the plot. Is largely, it's much more sort of escape. There's a little bit of a fish out of water element that's been used to describe like someone who's like out of their element. And so there's sort of hijinks ensue.
Yeah.
But it's also a little bit of just escape from place element.
Yeah.
And I think it worked. I think it worked really well. I think it was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it. It's funny, it's engaging, it's action packed adventure. It does not feel dull or slow at any points. We get a cameo from Bill Murray, who is one of my favorites. Who was very funny. And all kinds of fun stuff. So anyway, high recommend. Get yourself to a theater and go watch it if you're into the Marvel shindig. I think you will be pleased with this one.
Yeah, I was really, really impressed with it. I mean, I think the one point that you and I landed on more than anything was that Jonathan Majors is incredible.
Oh, yes.
In this movie.
Great point. Yes, Jonathan Majors was great.
I mean, he's great in everything I've ever seen him in, but he is incredible in this. I'm so glad that he's going to be like the main villain for the next several phases of the Marvel universe.
That was inspired casting. They did so good landing him for that role.
100%.
All right, we've gone long. Let's go ahead and say our thank yous and get out of here before we forget what we're doing and just keep rambling on for another hour. First, a big thank you to the Disseminating Behavior Analysis Special Interest Group for helping to support our efforts in this podcast and a generous grant donation. Also, thank you to our Patreon supporters who are receiving all kinds of benefits, and you can join those benefits. You get a Discord server, early access to episodes, ad-free episodes, bonus content, all sorts of things. And that includes Amanda, Brad, The Daily BA, Joshua, Justin, Justine, Kelly, Kim, Layla, Megan, Mike M, Mike T, Shauna, and Stephanie. If you've been listening long enough, you could maybe do that list from memory, and I would be proud of you if you could.
Yeah.
Also, I have a wonderful team of people without whom I could not do this. That includes Alan, Jess, Patrick, Justin, and of course, thank you for recording with me today, Shane.
Of course, anytime.
If we didn't have Justin, this would sound like a pile of mush, but fortunately he helps us stitch it all together into a coherent blob. Anyway, you can also support us by picking up some merch on our merch store. You can subscribe to our podcast so that it always shows up in your feed. Apparently, if you have it set to auto download and you do not listen to downloads after a while, it'll stop auto downloading, at least on iTunes. So be on the lookout for that. And otherwise, you can stream it when it comes out. It helps. It's great.
Yeah.
Or whenever you get around to it. I mean, the beautiful thing about evergreen podcasts such as ours, evergreen. is that you can listen to it whenever. It's like we're sort of anchored in time by what we know at the time that we record it. That's part of the reason we do our nostalgia episodes. Nevertheless, like it'll be relevant for, it's not like the news cycle for this week or today or something like that.
Right,
it's
right.
easy to come back to. Anyway, I think that's everything. Anything that I'm missing or anything you'd like to add, Shane, before we wrap up?
No, I think that covers it.
Perfect. This is Abraham.
This is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.